everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in just a moment. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Just giving Zoom a minute or two to add everybody to the room and then we will get started. Thank you. Hello everyone, just giving Zoom another 30 seconds or so to add people into the room and then we will get going. Thank you. Okay, hopefully Zoom has had a time to add everybody to the room. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to this Duke Media briefing on the subject of TikTok. I'm Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications. Concerns about data security have prompted the federal government and several states, including North Carolina, to ban the Chinese social media video app TikTok from government-owned devices. And the company's CEO is expected to testify before Congress next month. We have two Duke experts with us today to discuss the bans and explore the concerns about data and cybersecurity that prompted them. With us today is Robin Kaplan. She is a visiting assistant professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy and a founding member of the Platform Governance Research Network. She studies social media and data platform governance and media policy. Also joining us is Phil Napoli. He is a professor of public policy at Sanford and director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy at Duke, where, among other things, he researches new ideas for social media regulation. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Professor Napoli, we'll start with you. Can you tell us what are some of the major concerns driving these bans, and is there any sense that the bans will actually address those concerns?
Sure. So there's sort of intersecting concerns. One is obviously around user data privacy and security and the way user data could be used to track individuals who are important or influential, journalists, for example, government officials, for example. So there's that part. There's a data privacy and security part. And then there's also the way that that can connect with issues around our sort of longstanding concerns, or, at least post-2016 concerns around foreign influence operations and the way that digital platforms, social media platforms can be used to engage in very data-driven, very and targeted political influence operations on social media. Obviously, the highest profile example of this so far was what we have seen Russia do, but even in relation to the 2016 election. But those sort of actions have been ongoing, and we saw continued work in that space by other countries as well, even in the most recent midterms.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Kaplan, you work within the data privacy community. How does that community view these bans? And does that community believe that the bans will have the desired effect?
So the general consensus from what I've seen in the privacy community is that they reflect geopolitical tensions more than necessarily privacy risk. So you have prominent privacy scholars such as Ryan Calo from the University of Washington, who are stressing that though TikTok does collect a lot of data, it's not out of step with the norms of data collection done by the US apps. In terms of the relationship between TikTok and the Chinese government and whether that will lead to data sharing, particularly with regards to the types of actors that Phil was speaking about, Calo also stresses that there are myriad other ways for the CCP to get that type of location data, particularly on high-profile individuals.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both for those opening remarks. We'll open it up to questions now. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. You can also post questions in the Q&A window at any time. If you'd like to ask a question in person, raise your hand in Zoom and we will unmute you when your turn comes around. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. To start us off here, one of the things that Professor Kaplan, I'd like to come back to you and the comments you just made about the difference between the geopolitical concerns and the data sharing concerns. You've mentioned that there are other ways for the Chinese government to collect data if it wishes to do that, but again, there's a larger question here about commercial surveillance and what kind of data we might be giving up more broadly. Do you think that that's where more of this attention should be focused? And what are some of the concerns for individuals or institutions who are actually being surveilled commercially?
So I think this is a really important question because firstly, we need to think about the demographic of users that are on the TikTok app. These are mostly a younger generation of users. They're a very coveted generation of users. And they're ones that are concerned about commercial surveillance more generally. And they may not have those kinds of feelings of trust around commercial surveillance towards US apps either. So to the degree that TikTok can start a broader conversation about the nature of commercial surveillance and how we should be regulating that, I think this is a really important step. But taking an action on TikTok alone does little to address the privacy and surveillance concerns coming from those major US social media apps. One thing that really concerns me with this in particular, if we're not addressing commercial surveillance writ large, is that both Meta and Alphabet have developed competitors to TikTok, perhaps in preparation for this, perhaps just because this is, again, a very coveted user group that TikTok has cornered. And I think that without effective US privacy laws that impact similar data collection practices among US companies, banning TikTok writ large is really not going to do much to assuage concerns about surveillance, particularly among this age group. I think that one of the major concerns that can come with this is that, especially because these companies have been brought up a lot within public conversation about whether they are trustworthy, whether they are being used for nefarious ends by also countries like that are not necessarily the US. They're countries like Russia or whatnot have been able to have been shown to be on these platforms as well. That it's going to be interpreted kind of quite strangely amongst that age group, and that's one of my major concerns.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Napoli, I mean, we know that there's an element of grandstanding that comes along with, proposal for federal laws, testifying before Congress. But TikTok is certainly the dominant social media app, especially amongst young people. And when it comes to new ideas for social media regulation, obviously it's relatively speaking, a new app in which, social media itself isn't all that old. How do you even go about effectively regulating something that becomes so popular so quickly and has ultimately myriad concerns? I mean, are there effective ways that privacy could be protected on TikTok?
Oh, I think the short answer there is yes, and we've seen in the European Union there's much more expansive privacy protections than we have here. But I think what you're pointing out was sort of interesting too, which is this we've always in the US it's this very reactionary approach. Our model of sort of digital platform regulation has been first and foremost to do nothing, right? I mean, the politics of platform regulation have been so contentious that sort of that partisanship has been a key issue that's led to to very little action, even in the wake of what we've seen in 2016 and 2020. Even some really basic protections that were directed at foreign influence on digital platforms, like the Honest Ads Act, which would have provided some disclosures, all right, on who's sponsoring actual advertisements. Things like that went nowhere. And then, we go back further, obviously our tech policy in the US more broadly has been one of really trying to promote and promote innovation. So Section 230, which, grants these digital platforms incredible amounts of immunity from liability, was about trying to make sure platforms can grow as fast and be as influential and as successful as possible. And so, this is in keeping with that, so this move is very, the potential move is reactionary. It would be nice if guidelines and restrictions were in place, before these platforms have reached this incredible degree of prominence. And then it's, then we're to that sort of adage about, can you put the horse back in the barn? Can you put the genie back in the bottle? something, if you look at, if this leads to crafting some specific policies going forward that impact the next TikTok and how these platforms actually develop and how their design is realized, that would be useful.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Kaplan, you've studied the culture of TikTok. I mean, every time it seems like a new social media app becomes dominant, because I guess we're used to kind of long horizons in media. We think, oh, this is how it's going to be for years. But then, of course, Facebook comes along, Twitter comes along, now TikTok comes along. Do you have any sense whether, TikTok is going to be more durable, perhaps, than other social media apps have been amongst the young? Or are we already in a kind of cyclical situation where every 5 years or so, a newer generation of, say, young teenagers is going to latch onto something else? Is there anything about TikTok that you think is going to make it kind of the prominent app for maybe a bit longer than we've seen in other cases?
A really great question. And I'm not certain I can totally tell the future in that sense. I think that the rate of adoption for TikTok has far exceeded most other apps. They crossed over 1 billion downloads last year. They became the most downloaded app within the App Store, surpassing all of the Facebook products. And they really do seem to have cornered a particular type of market, which is a younger generation of users, but they don't seem to be only confined to that user group. They're making pretty significant strides within other age ranges as well, like the 30 to 50 age range. We've seen this before, though. We've seen that with, the apps of the major companies too. Instagram was a hugely popular app that has been on the decline for some time. So we can't really control. We don't really know the future of the popularity of these types of apps and whether or not there will be another one. Vine was a popular app. A lot of people compared TikTok to Vine when it first came out. Vine was never even close to what TikTok has become in terms of downloads. But again, it's very difficult to tell.
Sure. And thank you very much for tackling a crystal ball question. I love how faculty don't tend to enjoy those. I appreciate you taking it on. Professor Napoli, in the US Senate, a couple of Republican senators introduced a bill to just ban TikTok in the entire country. Like, is that even technically feasible, or how could that even work?
Well, that's a good question. And we should emphasize, too, that it's, this what's been interesting about this particular context is it's actually more bipartisan than most of the digital platform issues that have arisen in the past, right? So it's I think the legislation is bipartisan in this case. It would go to the, obviously now there was just recent calls for the, for the Google Play and the Apple App Stores to stop carrying the app. The enforcement of this, that's not my specialty, but I can imagine that would be tricky. We're already seeing, obvious loopholes in how, states and universities in the US that have imposed this ban, that make enforcement sort of in many ways non-existent. So if universities are banning the app on their networks, and then the students say, oh, well, that's annoying. Now I have to, switch off to use my data plan, and they still have the app, right? So, this would have to be, for it to be a bona fide blanket ban. And again, different from what we're seeing even at, with the bans that we're seeing in states where the bans are focused on government-owned devices. This would need to be a very centralized enforcement process.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I wanted to follow up on something you said. You mentioned how there does seem to be some bipartisanship around this, I guess, because of the perceived threat from China. Do you think that makes some sort of legislation or regulation of TikTok or social media more broadly actually more feasible, since usually they get bogged down, in the partisan squabbles that have deadlocked Washington for so long?
Yes, and I think that's one of the most interesting things, and maybe this is indicative of a larger trend. If you approach this from the perspective, I think privacy is one of those areas where there's always been some degree of bipartisanship. But if you think about the realm, the related realm of foreign political influence. One of the things, if you look over the past 6-7 years, is that that's been a very partisan issue, that there has not been bipartisan concern and support for trying to limit foreign influence operations. So to the extent that this is part of the sort of expressed concerns around TikTok, that's a change. That's an important change. And so, may lead to some actual action on this front, may lead to action that ultimately we decide is kind of heavy-handed. But even something heavy-handed would be a huge change from the inaction we've seen across the spectrum of digital platform issues over the past few years.
Absolutely, thank you, Professor Kaplan. A scroll through TikTok, and a lot of what people see is, videos of themselves cooking or doing pranks or random kind of stuff. And I can understand some people saying, well, if the Chinese government or anybody else wants to watch me doing dumb stuff on TikTok, let them. There's no harm in it. Do you think people are maybe sometimes missing the point about what they're sharing online, or not realizing, how the extent to which their privacy may be compromised? Or is a lot of the information that people are sharing actually pretty harmless?
Again, I think that's a difficult question just because of how much of our lives that we are living out online. So when we carry these phones around with us every single day, we are sharing data about ourselves at every single moment. We are sharing data about who we are with, who we are nearby. We are sharing data about what we're searching for, what we are buying. That is in addition to, for instance, what we're thinking about within this context, which are, little snippets of people's lives that they are sharing over video. Of course, TikTok collects a lot of app that is included within, what is collected on here. They may collect things like keystroke data, or they have in the past. I think they stopped because there were some concerns about that. They will collect things like your name and your email. They'll collect your IP address. And then there's a range of other types of data that the privacy policy permits that has caused some concern. So that is the keystroke pattern, which again, they have said that they no longer collect, I believe, and some biometric information, but I'm not quite certain what that consists of. Again, that's not necessarily out of step with what the major US social media companies will collect as well. So yeah, I think it's important to keep this in perspective, that our activities online are one source of data and information that we're giving these companies, the videos that we're creating, and the captions that we are using, the tags that we are using, the photos that we're putting online. But there's a whole host of other types of data that we share on an ongoing basis as we go about our daily lives as basically default now.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And in another context, I would say it was really convenient that you had a phone to hand that you could just hold up. But of course, that's how we live our lives. They're never more than 12 inches away from our hands, and we should always be cognizant of that. Professor Napoli, coming back to you, you had mentioned, about universities and institutions, and obviously it's not just kind of governments that have to be concerned about this. Should, institutions, higher education, other nonprofits or corporations even be thinking more carefully about the use of social media, on their own devices or within their operations? Is that something that should be a security consideration for institutions as well?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think that's where, the point Robin makes, that it would be great if this sort of bipartisan concern, that is zeroed in around TikTok, were to genuinely prompt finally, right, a more robust conversation about the nature of the data gathering and the uses of these data that all of these commercial platforms engage in. And if institutions really started to ask themselves, what are the full range of vulnerabilities that they are subjecting themselves to when they allow their employees, their students, et cetera, access to these platforms on their networks. What are the full range of vulnerabilities that could be arising there?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Kaplan, you study TikTok, and of course, that kind of research is more important than ever when we're trying to establish what kind of a threat the data security issues might be. Do these bans complicate that? How's the TikTok research landscape given everything that's happening?
So people are terrified. I am seeing a lot of conversation on research listservs like the Association of Internet Researchers from researchers studying TikTok that are located in places like Texas that now have found that they can no longer access TikTok, and so they can no longer do their research. It's becoming a very big barrier, and the community is responding in very interesting ways. They're trying to figure out ways to kind of share data between people. I know there are some interesting projects from some organizations, which I won't announce it for them, that are trying to figure out how to make TikTok data more accessible and more searchable. TikTok is a notoriously difficult app to study, actually. So there has been some discussion about workarounds with that for some time, but these bans are making it really, really difficult for a lot of academics to do their work.
Thank you. You mentioned that TikTok's very, very difficult to study. Is that like for technical reasons, or are there cultural or other reasons that make it difficult to get a handle on?
Both. For technical reasons, there's definitely things that the app could do to improve how it, even just its search function. For just to make it easier for a researcher to kind of access the types of videos that they are looking for and also sort them in ways that are useful. Part of it is with the culture of TikTok itself. So TikTok's use of hashtags is very strange and unlike a lot of other platforms. So whereas on YouTube or TikTok, you'll see, or YouTube or Twitter, you'll see the use of hashtags, and it's really kind of people genuinely using it to try and gain access to a particular community or to label what they're speaking about. TikTok, there's very limited uses of hashtags, and it's normally done around kind of major trends. And so they, even if it has very little bearing on what the actual video is. Sometimes that is intentional. A lot of the work that I do on TikTok, I'm about to submit a paper on this soon, is on mutual aid practices on the app. There's a lot of activism that happens on TikTok. A lot of the strategic use of hashtags is to try and spread awareness about particular issues and concerns. And so they are using it very, very strategically to do things like get into the For You page or to become kind of part of conversations that are trending on the app. But it's just a kind of general practice. So it's a difficult app to study for both technical and cultural reasons.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for that additional context. Professor Napoli, coming back to this, this idea of how much data we're sharing, and you've mentioned that, in Europe, there are tighter regulations on this. Do we even have a handle in the US on how much data sharing we can opt out of? The cellular phone companies may say, oh, no, absolutely, we're not tracking you at all, but we know that our phones always know where we are. Do we even kind of have general knowledge in this country about what we are sharing? And is it really clear whether the phone companies and social media companies are holding up their end of the bargain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and when people research, how rigorously users inform themselves, right, about the terms and conditions, about the apps or the devices that they use, the answer, probably not surprisingly, is folks really, the norm is not to really, be that well informed. Do these providers oftentimes make it difficult and sort of, require you to do a lot of clicking through to a lot of places to learn exactly what what you are agreeing to when you download an app, for example? That can often, yes, that can often be, require some real work to be a well-informed consumer about what you are agreeing to in terms of the uses of your data. I mean, and that's one of the spaces where if we had more mandated transparency and simplicity around terms and conditions related to our user data, that would be just one example of where we could that would be a valuable improvement.
Sure, absolutely. I'm sure we're all accustomed to just clicking yes and accept when all we want to do is order a pizza. Professor Kaplan, coming back to you, the discussion here is about the potential for bans in the US of TikTok because it's Chinese owned. what would that look like? Would we ultimately, could there be a domino effect if we looked at banning TikTok? What else would we have to consider if we were concerned about those same kind of issues?
So that's one of my major concerns, is that there's TikTok is not the only app, Chinese app, that is popular in the US. So WeChat is a hugely popular app. It's one that is used by a lot of people who now live in North America or Europe to communicate with their family in places like China. And so that's a major concern. Shein as well, which is a kind of fast fashion brand, has, I think, briefly overtook Amazon in global downloads in 2022 as well. So there's a lot of other apps that we would need to consider if we are kind of making this decision just based on the fact that this company is Chinese owned. There are other apps that are owned by people living in China where there's similar issues with data sharing or potential similar issues with data sharing. And I'm worried that this opens a bit of a floodgate for some of those other apps as well.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We're going to wrap up here in a few minutes. Just to let you guys know, if you would like to ask any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A window and I'll ask them out loud, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Professor Napoli, coming back to you. The concern here has been about, the Chinese government accessing data. There are also obviously concerns about domestic surveillance and the US government having information on consumers. Is there a concern here that while the US currently needs, a warrant to access devices, that with the amount of data collection happening, the US could just simply purchase it from companies that are gathering it en masse? How much of a concern should we have about domestic surveillance versus what might be happening from China?
That's a great question. And in fact, we have some researchers here in the DeWitt Wallace Center who have been doing a lot of work and even testified before Congress fairly recently on data brokers, right? I mean, the data brokerage business is really, I think, what you're describing, and it provides opportunities for all sorts of stakeholders to purchase massive quantities of data, and data brokers can aggregate data from multiple sources and sort of package and resell it, right? And create new aggregations that perhaps that are of huge value. And so the data brokerage industry is another sector that Congress has been good to see is taking a look at, and it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, emerges there.
Sure, thank you. And I'm sure I'm not alone in assuming that my number has been sold whenever I have a day that I get 17 robocalls or texts asking me for one thing or another. We're going to wrap up here in a moment, but I wanted to ask each of you a final question. Professor Kaplan, obviously there's a lot of grandstanding, as I mentioned, involved in the whole congressional thing around TikTok. But where do you think people should be paying attention to in this issue, the future of TikTok and of data privacy over the next few months and year? Like, where do you think the interesting stuff is going to be happening?
I think bigger conversations about commercial surveillance that are now finally starting to happen is an important thing to pay attention to. There was recently a call, Phil, it was the FTC, right?
What was that?
There was a recent call for comment
Yes.
about potential new regulations regarding commercial surveillance that a bunch of organizations gave comments to, including the organization where I'm currently at, Data and Society. But moreover, I think that these conversations about TikTok bring up these bigger issues and concerns that we have with all of these other major US social media apps and just major social media apps in general. And they're conversations that are not only being asked here, but they're being asked all over the world. And so, in as much as conversations about TikTok can start to bring this up more generally, I see this as a positive direction, but seeing TikTok as some sort of anomaly within this space, I'm not certain if that's necessarily correct.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Napoli, we'll finish with you. There are these calls for bans. There's going to be the congressional testimony next month. Do you think that will ultimately make any difference, or is it mostly a political storm in a teacup, do you think?
Like I said, I don't know that this, I guess maybe I'm reacting. It's just, I'm so, it's such a weird and novel thing, right, to see some bipartisanship in any digital policy space. So, I don't, the usual model is, yes, is sort of, to earn political points, to take a stand and a very aggressive and, unrealistic stand on something that's probably never going to happen, right? Or more particular in this particular political moment of so much polarization in the US, to take a stand that's in strong opposition to the other party, right? That's really how you earn your political points. And so if we're in a moment where both Republican and Democratic lawmakers actually earn political points, if taking a particular stand in relation to this TikTok issue is, if that's the case, then that starts to sound a little more like how we hope our policymaking process works. I don't think this is really one of those cases of our political representatives really reacting to public opinion. We could argue whether that's a good or a bad thing, because as Robin pointed out, this is a very popular app, and there's a lot of people who are going to be very pissed off if it gets banned. This is just a different animal, I feel like, from what we've been accustomed to over the past few years in terms of the digital policy space.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I appreciate your perspectives. I think we will call it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Robin Kaplan and Phil Napoli, for sharing your expertise and opinions. We'll be holding briefings later this month on abortion rights and prenatal care, as well as the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you'd like to be notified about those and other upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu, or if you're watching on YouTube, just like and subscribe.